Well, good evening. Thanks for having me. Um, it's 11 o'clock on a Friday morning here, and the reason is that the Right Reverend Penner assured you that I'd be up at 5 in the morning running or something, and I'd be all up for joining you live, um, which was another one of his. Um, how do I put this kindly? Mistakes, as it were. So, Rob, thank you for your attempt to get me live, but this is the best I can do at the moment. So, I do thank you for the privilege of being a part of this. It's good to be with you, and I wish I could see your faces, but perhaps Away can send me the video of your Zoom call. I'm not sure how that works. Anyway, I really can't add anything to what Eugene has done in his wonderful close reading of Genesis. So I would say um, my comments will be sort of a footnote with a few stories to a paragraph or two. And I'd like to focus on chapter 5 that Eugene began. But let me just say this. As it's often pointed out, Genesis is a book of beginnings, and it's the beginning of everything and the beginning of everyone. In Genesis language, it's heaven and earth. The totality of all that we experience, and probably much more than what we experience. But this does not mean that Genesis lies in the past for us. Its power is not what has happened, but its power lies in what is happening. As Eugene noted, that Genesis is quoted more than 200 times in the New Testament, and I hadn't realized that. And but it shows you that Genesis, 4,000 years later, then at the writing of the New Testament, had deep relevance, and that the writers of the New Testament understood that Revelation, or that Genesis, continued to reveal itself in this new revelation, in this final revelation of God in Christ, in Jesus of Nazareth. So Genesis then is to be read and lived in the present. In the beginning, God is a present reality to which you and I awaken every morning. It's not simply serve as an argument against scientific materialism, but if we were to befriend the narrator, as Eugene suggests, we would take care to listen to Genesis now, today. Hebrews 11:4 reminds us that, and by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. Abel is one of the living dead, as it were, and he speaks not to scare the wits out of us, but he speaks out of his life and death into our own life and into our own stories, into our own, and ultimately into our own deaths. So Genesis 5 says we're not alone. We are part of, indeed, of this communion of saints, this cloud of witnesses that the writer of Hebrews would have us see living all around us, still living, still speaking. And so that's the spirit into which we enter Genesis, I think. So Eugene began the reading of Genesis, not in chapter 1, but in chapter 5, which surprised me a lot, but which I also liked a lot. It goes like this, and I've given you a handout just to point out a couple of things that Away has sent you as well. Chapter 5 goes like this. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind when they were created. Mankind meaning Adam. So here we are, Adams, people, human beings, humankind, mankind. We're made, we're blessed, and we're named. We're not simply the nameless, faceless, anonymous public. We're not consumers or citizens or earthlings or the inhabitants of planet Earth. We're not John and Jane Doe or John and Judy Chan. No, we're made one at a time, born unique in the variedness of the image of God, of God's image, and then we're blessed and we're named. This last summer, Amy and I did a 3-day backpacking trip into Banff National Park, which is not far, a few hours from where we live here in Cranbrook. And we came across, near a campsite, a backcountry campsite, something called a public shelter, and which made me cringe, because a public shelter usually means it's been ill-maintained, as it were, and you never know exactly who and what you're going to find when you enter the public shelter. And so we had our own tents, and so we stayed in the tent. But what I got to thinking was, when John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world," he didn't say, "For God so loved the public." We're not the public. We are known and loved and made. And it is that for whom he died. It is heaven and earth. It's for the Adams, the people of earth, who are known deeply. But Eugene mentioned that the Hebrew word for account is the Hebrew word toledot, meaning genealogy, our family tree, our ancestors, our relatives. It's not where you come from, but who do you come from? But toledot comes from another Hebrew word, yalad, which means to give birth. And we're born. As Eugene Peterson was fond of saying, before we were born again, we're simply born. And so practically, before we talk about being remade in the image of Christ, we need to first talk about what does it mean to be made in the likeness of God. What does it mean to be simply born into this existence, into this life that we are a part of? According to Genesis, being born is a big deal. To have a birthday is no small thing. And so why is that? Well, if we're not born, we don't have a history. We don't have a future. We don't have a God. We don't have a God to love, and we don't have a neighbor to keep. And so this mysterious journey we call life begins by being born. I remember when our first child, Zach, was born. We have 4 kids, and Zach was the first, and Zach was an emergency cesarean. And after hours of labor for Amy, Zach's little life was now in danger. So all of a sudden, she gets whisked away into the OR, leaving Dad in the hallway, initially alone. But I remember after what seemed like hours, as I held this little 6-pound something boy in my arms for the first time, that now he had a life. Not that simply that he was living, for which I was completely grateful, but that he had a life. This little made in the image of God person was responsible now to the one who made him and to the one who died for him. And what was he going to do with that reality? That reality of God and God with us. What a responsibility he had, and what a gift he was given. And only 9 months ago, this was impossible. There's an Ash Wednesday prayer in the Book of Common Prayer that begins this way: Our Father in heaven, you hate nothing that you have made. You hate nothing you have made. And we are made, and we are born. We are blessed, and we are named. Why? Because the world, the cosmos, heaven and earth has been made, has been born, has been blessed and named. The world has a birthday, so we too have birthdays to celebrate and mark our lives as persons and not public. The other thing that Eugene noted in the formula in this genealogy, this account as it were, is the formula: he lived and then he died. With the exception of Enoch, of course, because he not only lived, but he also walked faithfully with God, which the narrator notes twice. And so he was mysteriously taken away. Enoch did not experience death as we know it. Of course, none of us have known it yet, but we soon shall. Maybe not tonight, but you know. So this formula of he lived and then he died is represented in most of the cemeteries that we know of on the gravestones. So-and-so, there's a date, and then there's a dash, and then there's another date. And so there is our birthday and our death day. And that dash, that little brief line, that's our life. That's it. The Bible calls that short, but also sweet, by God's grace. So the Bible reminds us that this story, this life, is brief, but it's full of meaning and import. But that dash is what we have to work with. And that ought not to paralyze us, but to enliven us. To receive that dash with gratitude and goodness. So I also noted in Eugene's notation of the formula the phrase "he lived," and he lived over and over again, over 25 times in that section that Eugene read. And the phrase goes like this: when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. And when Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. And he became the father, after he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died, etc. He lived, he lived, he lived. So not only to be born is a big deal, to have lived is a big deal as far as Genesis is concerned. The ever quotable British journalist G.K. Chesterton wrote a poem at the end of the 20th century entitled "The Great Minimum," and in which he celebrates our very existence as the great minimum. And in part it reads this way: in a world of flying loves and fading lusts, It is something to be sure of a desire. Lo, blessed are our ears, for they have heard. Yea, blessed are our eyes, for they've seen. Let the thunder break on man and beast and bird, and the lightning, it is something to have been. It is something to have been. It is no small thing to God, and hopefully to us. In another place, Chesterton wrote this: children are grateful when Santa Claus puts in their stockings gifts of toys or sweets. Could I not be grateful to Santa Claus when he put in my stockings the gift of 2 miraculous legs? We thank people for birthday presents of cigars and slippers. Can I thank no one for this birthday present of birth? Now, what are the pastoral and personal implications of this? This week, I happened to meet with a young married mom with 2 school-age children who is having some substantial relational problems with her mom. Sound familiar to anyone? Anyway, her mom and her father were divorced when she was very young, and she was raised by her stepfather after her mom remarried. She's an only child, but her biological father, from whom she'd been estranged almost since the time of him leaving the home, has re-entered her life in his retirement. And he's re-entered it in a wonderful way. They both worked at overcoming the alienation. And this has been relatively recent. But this has caused deep anger and resentment in her mom. Because as far as her mom is concerned, this is the man who deserted her and her only daughter, her only child, years ago, walked out, and kept up the often kept up the monetary responsibilities, but was gone physically, nowhere to be found. But she's now reconciled with her biological father, but her mom will have none of it. Her old angers and bitterness have been kept and nurtured, and now they're spilling over into her daughter's life, into her grandchildren's life. She now has 2 young children of her own. And so what is she to do? She loves her biological father. She loves her stepfather and her mom. But as far as her mom and stepdad, they're not into this. So what do? We talked about Toledoth, her family. Where have you come from? Who are they? What are their stories? And how those stories might impact you in your story and in your journey at this moment. So we began to explore those just a little. And so stories were told, tears were shed, memories offered up. And with those memories came some understanding, some clarity. Not resolution, not reconciliation. I don't know if that will ever come. But she is able to live with more understanding. And perhaps with that, the future can be made with her mom. She began to understand that she is not God. There's only one Savior, and it ain't her. She's a child. She'll always be a child to her mom. And she more profoundly will be a child to her God. So it's these Toledoths, these ancestors, these relatives, these stories that they hold and carry that we are to attend to pay attention to lovingly, with vulnerability and with honesty. One final observation about this, and is that if our congregations are not places in which stories can be told, honest stories about our toledots, about our birthdays, about our lives, then if that can't happen, doesn't matter what we call ourselves, we are not churches. Churches are communities of stories. God created man because he loves stories, as Elie Wiesel, the Jewish author, said. If we do not love people's stories and don't know those stories, we can't be a church. And that includes pastors and elders and everybody else. There needs to be stories told and places for those to be told and healed and laughed over and loved. It's not easy. Not easy. But it's wonderful when it happens. So that's Jones's footnotes for the day. And again, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this little seminary around Genesis. So go in peace to love and serve the Lord.